API and just test it out?
Yeah, we have a demo, which is okay a few times, but then also...
Right. Good, how are you? Good to see you. Pleasure, thank you for coming down. Jace, Roy, Jace.
How are you
Used to work at Smart Spot.
There should
Yeah, I did. Telephone did, yes. Actually, Pure Places actually had lunch on the way.
Let's see how it's Hey, I recognize you. How are you? Likewise.
It was squishy we did last time. Yeah, good? No.
Because I'll probably have to be walking around. Someone else told me Oh, Ansel. He was there. He was part of I am part of the... Oh, are you? Yeah,
Tell me. Help me. I'm going to bring water bottles instead of the jar.
Funny from the inside.
There's a lot of that Stacey going on. We're not doing anything here,
But in the ID where I spent the previous
young leaders. Only if it's like I'd like to just be like, is it the
enough details and we can always get hold of it. How good is that? So you need to
¿Qué tal, Jaime? Es una birra, ¿no? Es verdad. No. Cerveza no sé. ¿Qué tal? Oye. Estoy hablando con los
We get the partners how well full extent. And I'm working on that, like, just working out the challenges, working at the partner side, mentors that I want, the coaching side, just mentors, more domain expertise, more understanding of the ecosystem, much more vested interest, which means that there's something that into the land, that sort of thing. Is that yours? You put your body in it? So heavy as well.
Funny for me, what do you say? Pero también mandamos y también hacemos cálculo de GPS doble para tener y después lo mandamos pero esa conexión eso es no para tener y es que vosotros queréis estar más cerca de los bancos. Sí, pero es que no veo, o sea, necesito sentarme con alguien que me dice que debo poner con el director, pero es que nosotros sabemos que hacemos de GPS, pero data analytics are el proyecto es un nicho y en 5G works like a charm porque es perfecto y es un sistema híbrido. Hacemos cambios eso también lo vamos modificando en distintas zonas porque encima tenemos crowdsourcing de lo que está pasando porque aquí los algoritmos serán perfectos en las áreas donde tengamos También no le importa si me echas una mano, yo me muevo, tú sabes que yo cojo un avión, si me tengo que ir a Madrid, me voy a Madrid, tenemos oficina en Barcelona también, ya tenemos 6 personas, nos vamos a las oficinas de cada país, de Barcelona. Bueno, ellos van a cogerme en las oficinas, la oficina es para 10 personas. Bueno, hay dos cosas que quiero hacer un negocio. Son iraníes, estos yo tengo muchos amigos que son de Estados Unidos, mis mejores amigos, cuatro palabras en iraníes, yo flipará con qué bueno, que la realidad tan buenísima. Bueno, tío, me conoces, muchos tipos. Bueno, seguimos.
Being behind the camera.
There?
I don't know what that is. I guess people are not showing up. I don't For me, it's okay because I'm going to do things like that. I'm actually going to continue because I've come up actually with a couple of time plans. Use that as a
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm sorry we're slightly delayed, but that's the life of an entrepreneur. You don't want to hear from me. I'm Kim Andrew. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Telefonica Open Future and Wayra UK. I can't tell you how excited and delighted we are to have you here and to have our two guests. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce them. We have with us the Global Tech Correspondent for the Financial Times, Tim Bradshaw, and he will be talking to serial entrepreneur Ali Partovi. Thank you so much, gents.
Hi, thanks very much. Is this on? Can you hear me all right? No? Maybe the button.
Hello.
Hello. Is that better? Yeah. It's just a question of turning it on. First track of technology is to turn it off and on again. Ali, thank you very much indeed for joining me and for all of us here. This is my first time doing one of these actually at Telefonica and Wayra. So do you want to start off with giving it for people that don't? I mean, I'm a reporter at the Financial Times. You're not here to hear from me, and we'll definitely open up for questions as we get along. But Ali, do you want to give a quick introduction of your kind of background and how you got started in Silicon Valley?
Oh, that better. That's better. Okay, great.
Start over.
Yeah. I was just going to say, would you?
Who am I?
Yes.
Why am I
Would you
here?
like to give a quick introduction? I'm Tim Bradshaw. I'm a tech reporter at the Financial Times. I spent 6.5 years in Silicon Valley and California, and moved back to London at the end of last year, where we met very briefly when we were out there. But yeah, tell for those of us who haven't heard it.
Yes, my name is Ali. I think my first introduction to tech was when I was 9 years old. My mom and dad got a personal computer for my twin brother and me when we grew up in Iran, and we learned to program. We learned how to program when we were very young, and that was a very seminal moment in our lives because it introduced us to how fun and creative computer programming can be, and we fell in love with it. I majored in computer science in university, and when I was 23, was really fortunate to join some of my classmates in starting a company called Link Exchange. This was the first advertising network on the internet back in 1996. And we sold the company when I was 26 to Microsoft. And since then I've been an angel investor, and I've had the privilege to invest in some great companies and also to fail to invest in even better companies. So I've had lots of good stories from both positive and negative. And now today I run a fund called NEO, which it's actually a community and a fund. I call it a communal venture fund. So it's a community of tech veterans coming together to pool their money and invest their time and their money into trying to cultivate the next generation of tech leaders. And NEO is really focused around trying to find the most promising undergraduate computer scientists in North America and to cultivate them into leaders of tomorrow.
How did you find that transition from being an entrepreneur to being an investor, and what does being an entrepreneur equip you to do well as an angel investor, and what did you have to kind of learn more as a sort of investor side of things?
Yeah, so there was, in my case, it certainly was not with intent. You know, the transition was that I was financially insecure most of my life until after once my company was acquired. Suddenly I was financially independent and had never experienced having wealth before, and so then investing was more almost out of a sense of responsibility that if I have money, I ought to do something with it and not have it you know, just sit in a bank account. And so I started investing in companies. I think the other thing is, after
what was your first investment?
The very first one probably was Zappos, which actually did quite well. It was my
Yeah.
yes, yeah, my co-founder of my first company was Tony Hsieh, who's now, who's still CEO of Zappos. But what I was going to say is that actually the downside of having been an entrepreneur who was successful is that I had a lot of hubris. At age 26, I was probably one of the most successful people from my own college and of my age group, and so I had the sense that I'm surely must be smarter than everybody because I'd done so well. And investing is a opportunity to really let your hubris run wild, because you get to have people tell you what they're passionate about, and you get to judge whether it's a good idea or not. So I think for me the first few years were largely about losing that hubris and kind of recognizing I'm not infallible and coming back down to earth. I think I've been more successful after that.
Was there a particular moment where you kind of realized, oh my God, this is a lot harder than I thought, or a particular kind of something that you realized in retrospect, you should have made that bet, but didn't?
Oh yeah, many of those. I think that the lesson I learned from running my own company, which was a very clear, and I would say has been probably the most important lesson of my life, is the importance of people. And I remember after I sold my first startup, my twin brother, Hadi, was starting his first company and asked me what are the 3 most important pieces of advice I could give him. And I said, easy, number 1, hire great people. Number 2, hire great people. Number 3, hire great people. And it had been very clear from running a company that the biggest decisions are all about people. I frequently would relive the highs or the lows or the best and worst moments, and they all had to do with, we should have fired this person, or we should have promoted this person, and it was always the best moments were somebody who really shined because we gave them a lot of responsibility. And so, so when during this process of realizing how important this was, I remember actually deciding that I wanted to, if there was one skill I wanted to intentionally develop and improve, it was the ability to assess people. However, I didn't realize that the same would apply to investing, and it took me a few years of making some mistakes to realize that, in fact, perhaps the same approach would be a good approach to investing.
So what is the approach? Because your new fund is very talent focused.
Yeah, my new fund is very much about that. But
a lot of investors that I speak to kind of say you don't invest in the idea or the business plan. You invest in the individual and trust that however many pivots or heartbreak turns they might have to make on the way, that the individual is going to succeed. But so, is that the philosophy, or is it kind of earlier almost than that? If you're investing in people who are still at college.
No, so I would agree with that philosophy. I would say that my fund takes that to kind of an extreme. A lot of people will say they invest in people, but it takes a lot of discipline to, for example, if you love the idea but have doubts about people, to reject it. Or vice versa, if you really are impressed with the person but have doubts about the idea, it can take a lot of discipline to invest in it.
So have you made investments on a thing you thought was a terrible idea, but a great entrepreneur?
Yes, and I'd say I should start with the reverse, which is your earlier question about what were some kind of learning moments. One of the smartest people in my first startup, actually technically he was a contractor, so he wasn't a full-time employee, but when I was 26, this guy was 22, but he was brilliant. He was legendary within our group. His name was Max Levchin, and after we sold the company, he left to start PayPal. And there was no question how brilliant this guy was, but the original concept for PayPal was a complete joke. It would have made a good comic episode today. It was an app for sending money from a Palm Pilot device to your friend, as long as you both owned the Palm Pilot device and used the infrared port, and you had to be within visual distance with nothing obstructing the infrared. It was basically useless. If you're that close, you could just give to the other person.
Where's the fun in that? And you can beam it through infrared, but yes.
Well, also nobody owned Palm Pilots, so it was anyway, the idea was terrible, and I did not invest in it. And a few years later, realized, oh wow, I missed out on
becoming part of the PayPal mafia.
Well, more importantly, it was somebody I knew well as a friend who was absolutely brilliant. It was a very easy thing to have said, just invest in him because it's Max. And similarly, one of the smartest, if not the smartest, kids from college in the computer science department at Harvard, where I went, was Craig Silverstein, and he emailed a whole group of us. Shortly after I had sold my company, I got an email from him saying, hey everybody, I'm finally doing this Silicon Valley thing. I'm joining up with my PhD buddies from Stanford, Larry and Sergey, and I'm going to be the first employee and CTO of this new Google company. And I remember thinking, just because you have a better algorithm, you think you're going to beat all the other search engines. So I, deleted that email and did not follow up on it, and missed out on easily what would have been the best investment of my life, probably. And then in hindsight, started realizing, ooh, this was I didn't need to read anything about the idea. I should have just said, Craig Silverstein is doing a startup. I should invest in it and forget about what the idea is.
When did you sort of realize that wasn't a good career? Did you meet Larry and Sergey again soon after? And
it wasn't, I think it was by 19.
Did you have a sense from them, again, and to the point of like identifying talent, was it immediately obvious that they were smart at that point? I mean, they were smart, but capable.
Yeah, so I don't think I met them until after Google had already started becoming successful. I think like 2000, I think, is when I started realizing, wait, is this the same company that Craig had joined? And then started realizing, yeah, so basically by 2001 or 2002, when Google was founded, it was becoming very, very successful, and I had had enough investing experience to kind of look backwards and see what were the common things amongst my successful investments and the unsuccessful ones, or so on, and started realizing that the common thread amongst the good investments were the people more so than any particular other.
Just before we go any further, because you seem to be doing yourself down a little bit, let's just sort of run through a list of some of the more successful investments on here, which include Facebook, Dropbox, Airbnb, Uber, Pinterest. I mean, there's a lot of household names on here. So you're doing, you've kind of tuned it since those early days a little bit.
Yes.
But so how much has the sort of approach to investing changed since that time? Because you were there in the kind of first .com boom. There was a slightly more fallow period, and now we're back up to those kind of highs again. I mean, both the sort of number of entrepreneurs has increased, and to some extent, I guess the competition to get in at an early stage has increased. Has what you do changed a lot, or is it fundamentally the kind of process that you go through to evaluate whether somebody meets your criteria? Is that kind of the same as it was 20 years ago?
I would say it's evolved, but it's what's been sort of true for at least 15 years has been a very strong focus on people. And and I've had cases where somebody that I really believed in was starting a company, and I invested in it either despite serious misgivings about the idea or having no clue, no understanding at all about the idea. So, I mean, probably the most notable example of this was actually my brother and I got involved in Facebook. I actually had misgivings about the actual business. So this was very early. So this was when Facebook had maybe, I think, 200,000 users. It was a 7 or 8 person company running out of a frat house type environment in Palo Alto, and it was limited to college users. And it was, if I remember correctly, the architecture was also very not very scalable. They had a separate server for each university, and so their plan was they were in 20 universities at the time, and they needed to buy more servers so they could expand to more universities. And it seemed like, like MySpace, but limited to colleges. It was, the clarity of how big it could be was not about the idea, it was about the people there, and Mark in particular, but also Dustin and some of the other individuals were just incredibly smart and incredibly ambitious. And the reason we invested in that company was more than anything because of recognizing how unique these individuals were.
But what was it at that moment that you kind of identified at people, and what, again, can you sort of detail a bit more your kind of criteria, or is it more just sort of intuition? I mean, especially if you're dealing with people with effectively no experience or no qualifications, like how do you get a sense that Mark Zuckerberg is Mark Zuckerberg?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any, it's kind of hard to kind of make a list. Certainly for me, one thing that's been important is having at least somebody on a team be very strong technically. It doesn't need to be everyone on the team, but having at least one really, really, top of their game computer programmer.
Very strong as demonstrated how? Just in the product or in the classes they went to?
You can identify great programmers, I think, quite young. I mean, depends on whether they had access to computers. In my case, I started programming when I was 9, and folks who've been programming since they were young and who are really smart stand out from the rest. And by the time my brother and I invested in Dropbox, we'd been helping companies recruit by recruiting people from college. So we'd referred a lot of college-aged undergraduate computer scientists to join Facebook, and so we would give coding tests to students to evaluate them before recruiting them to places like Facebook. And so when the way we discovered Dropbox was we asked one of these students who we had referred to Facebook, who are the smartest kids in your class at MIT? And he said, well, everyone knows this guy, Arash Ferdowsi, who is senior at MIT at the time, but he's not going to join Facebook or anything else because he has his own startup, which was Dropbox. And we were really excited about the Dropbox business or idea, but we then actually gave coding tests to Arash and Drew, who was the main founder. And essentially, the same screen that we would use to decide whether somebody's worth hiring as an engineer, we also applied to see whether it's worth investing in them. And frankly, I'd say it's a pretty straightforward thing to say. If somebody is, if they were not technical enough to get a job at Facebook, then are they, strong enough to be worth investing in? So.
I mean, is that now that the infrastructure, I guess, is so much more established, is it helpful to kind of, I mean, I suppose you're consciously avoiding this with what you're doing at Neo, in that you're not going to engineers who've proven themselves by getting through the ringer at Google or Facebook or one of these other sort of big established companies, which is a filter a lot of people use if you've kind of passed that. So how is the test the same, or are you able to kind of seek people out before they even know that they want to be entrepreneurs if they're at a certain kind of stage?
So with Neo, we're generally recruiting juniors and seniors in college. A lot of times they actually have already had internships at places like Facebook or Google. And some of the students will find started having internships in high school. And we, I've spent most of my career evaluating and assessing young people, and so it's hard for me to say a checklist of exactly how to do it, but it's like anything else with experience. Your brain, you develop sort of pattern matching intuitions. So I'd say if there's a super skill that I've tried to hone in life, it's this. But there's also with what I'm doing with Neo, it's not just myself. I have a community of other people who are also very successful in technology, and they volunteer their time to help both with interviewing and with mentoring the young people that we find. So it's a little early to tell how we'll do on the investments, but the premise with it is essentially you're aiming to try to find the top 10 or 15 computer science students in North America each year and bring them into a community where we provide them mentorship and connections, and we also give them a guarantee of we'll invest in any startup they start. So it's actually pretty.
So there is no idea. So the earlier kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And they're not obliged to start a company, and they're also not obliged to take our money. But we simply say, if you start a company, if you want it, you can count on us to invest in it. And it's regardless of what the idea is. as long as it has a tech component. So if you start a restaurant, then that's, you know, we wouldn't invest in that.
Right.
But
unless it's a robot restaurant, or robot pizzeria or something.
Exactly.
But yeah.
Yes.
How are there particular kind of theses that you have that you would try? You know, if somebody super talented comes to you and kind of says, like, I just don't know what the right idea is right now, because in that community you sort of have so many options available to you when you're that young. Is there a, I mean, do you kind of have areas that you think are particularly exciting at the moment, or not so exciting that you would sort of say, okay, we've got enough food delivery startups now, please do something else?
Right, yeah, to be clear, I do still care about the idea. I just recognize that it's more important to assess how smart the person is.
Yeah, yeah. But
so
you know, the particular
yeah.
theses, I guess, at the moment.
Yeah, so for me, generally what I think about is if the person pitching me, if I start feeling like, you know what, this person is perhaps smarter than I am, then I'll stop trying to evaluate their idea and just evaluate how convinced are they about their idea. And if they have conviction and they're incredibly smart, then I'll want to invest in it no matter what. But sometimes they don't have conviction, or they're, like you said, wondering whether their idea is good or so on. I usually encourage people not to do a startup until they found an idea that they really love, where they're, you know, where they perhaps experienced a need or a problem and are, you know, themselves wish the solution was there because they had this need either as a consumer or in a previous role as a business. They realized how dire a certain problem is, and so they're starting a company to solve it. Those are usually, I find, the best kind of, the best founders are the ones who have close personal experience with the need. In terms of spaces, I'm generally a fan of marketplace type companies, and that's not a single space per se, but companies that bring together a network of buyers and sellers. And Airbnb is a marketplace for people, you know, in that case it's a very weird one in that it's a market that didn't exist in any sense before, and you know, pretty shocking that people would open their homes for strangers to come stay, but still is a marketplace. Uber likewise is a marketplace for drivers and passengers, and there's other types of marketplace companies, some that I've missed out on, but others that I've invested in. Thumbtack is another marketplace company I've invested in. Convoy likewise is like Uber but for trucking. So I'd say in general that's a realm I'm a big fan of. Trucking, by the way, I've also made an investment in self-driving trucks. So trucking as a whole, I think, trucking and logistics is a huge space, largely because of the size of it, but also because technology seems to have not touched it very much in the past. You know,
self-driving trucks, but not self-driving cars or taxis or something. Because the current moment is quite an interesting one for, there's a sort of breakaway group of, you know, Waymo and a couple of other big ones who've raised a lot of money in self-driving cars, but they still, it does not seem clear to me how quickly that gets to market. Is trucking a more near-term achievable area for that technology to succeed in?
I think so. You know, with the disclaimer that no one has a perfect crystal ball, but I generally try to avoid spaces that have become too hot or too hyped up. Usually, by then, it means the best deals are no longer available, and you know, and there's also a danger that if everybody thinks something is hot, they could all be wrong, because there could be sort of a herd mentality of just everyone going one way because others are going there.
Which happens quite often.
It happens quite often, yes, exactly. So, yeah, so I generally actually don't get excited about a startup simply because it's in a space that is hot. I would pay attention really to, like, who is the customer, what is the customer problem they're solving, how bad, you know, how big is that need, and so on. Anyway, with respect to self-driving, I'm generally a skeptic on self-driving. Not to say it's never going to happen, but I think it'll take much longer than people believe.
Much longer meaning decades? Or?
Could be decades. So the example I would say is, I remember when in 1998, in a different space, in the music space, 1998 was when the MP3 you know, became popular, the file format. Basically in 1998, the technology for digital music was done. It worked, it was perfect. And it took until 2018 for Spotify to go public. So it was a 20-year span after the technology was finished before the first company went public in that space. And those 20 years were largely about figuring out the legal and liability and business model questions. And the other factor was that people listened to music in their cars, and it took a long cycle for people whose cars had CD players to gradually cycle out and be replaced with cars that had aux-in ports or Bluetooth. And there's a really long cycle time for people getting rid of a expensive, large investment that they own. And so I guess I would say the day that self-driving technology is fully working, it'll still be a long time before it gets deployed.
Yeah.
And it's far from working today.
Right.
So.
Can I just ask, given the kind of focus on talent, how do you kind of deal with those situations where founders can maybe slightly kind of go off the rails, or the kind of culture of the company develops in a different way to what you sort of anticipated? And I mean, is that something that you can kind of foresee? I'm not naming any specific ride-hailing companies here, but just kind of generally, how do you kind of navigate that? Is that something you try and sort of steer people back on course, or do you just have to kind of trust them that it's their company, they know what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, every situation is different, but generally I feel, as an angel investor, you have limited influence. I'm now a VC as of, with Neo, I've only started
in a couple of months.
Neo, the fund is about a year old.
Okay.
So as a VC, you have more influence.
You announced it. So
we announced it more recently,
okay.
Yeah. But as an angel investor, you basically have to, give the entrepreneur, it's their company. You don't have, you can give them advice, but you can't really force their hand very much. What I would say is, I've always given advice from early on to be intentional about culture. Don't let culture just develop wherever it goes, but think about it, and also tell all the people in the company that they are all stewards of the culture. When a company is 10 people, no one might be thinking about culture yet, but if they realize that, before we know it, we're going to be 50 people, and the 10 people currently there are all going to be the old timers. And even when you're 50, those 50 people should consider that they will soon be the old timers if you grow to 100. And so, for example, Dropbox, when it was in hypergrowth mode, I would sort of give them a talk about culture and give the same talk every year, because by from year to year, the company was doubling in size, so half the people were new, essentially. So it's important, if you pay attention to it from the beginning and think about it intentionally as to what you want your culture to be like, that's a pretty good first step.
Just before we open it up for questions, as you kind of go through the new fund, is there any, the part of culture obviously is diversity and making sure everyone is well represented from all walks of life. Is that something that you're trying to do at a kind of early stage by kind of identifying more women entrepreneurs or color of different backgrounds, like as you kind of pull out? Or I mean, is that something you believe in being able to kind of do through any kind of methodical way, or do you just have to kind of wait for the right kinds of people to come through the system and emerge to the inside?
So I'm very intentional about diversity. I think of it in the way to make diversity really work is to show that it's profitable. Because if people are thinking, oh, well, we have a choice between either being diverse or profitable, they would choose profit. But if you can align it so that you can show that embracing diversity actually helps be more profitable, then it'll be what everybody would want to do. So there's several aspects that I'd say are pretty straightforward. One is that you can make better products if your team is diverse, because you won't miss any blind spots. So for example, Scott Forstall is a friend of mine who created the iPhone, and when the early team was building the iPhone, most of the team was male. But I think there was one female on the team, and when the early prototypes came out, everyone thought it worked great, except this one woman who had long nails. The tapping wouldn't work for her. It was like off. It was always off by few millimeters for where she would touch. And they had to completely retool it based on her experience. And if they didn't have that one woman on the team, they could have theoretically put out a product that didn't work for half the population. That's obviously for consumer devices, that's more relevant to, but I'd say in general, another factor is that the single most important task for any young company is recruiting. And it's easy when you start out to have your founding team be your buddies who will be all like you, and whether you're all white men or all women, the danger then is that your recruiting network is also going to be limited to that and will be reduced. So if you're a group of young, let's say young women from the same circle and you start a company together, it's then going to be a challenge to hire people who are different from yourself. Whereas if your founding team, or at least your early team, is diverse and you have balance of men and women and people from different ethnicities and different ages, you can cast a much wider net for recruiting. And recruiting is so challenging to begin with, and if your recruiting funnel is narrowed because of things like gender or ethnic lack of diversity, that's a real I'd say that's a real liability to the company.
Do we have questions from the floor, and do I need to run around with a mic, or is there another one? Okay. Anyone like to ask a question?
We're going to be very mean and say that you have to do a 30-second pitch.
Oh, I wasn't going to pitch, I was just So, obviously, emphasis on people, and you mentioned technical ability. What would 5 of the traits be that you, in order of ranking, that you sort of look for in founders and investors? Or even people you hire?
You're asking what are the top 5 traits that I look for in people that I invest in?
So there was technical ability mentioned.
Yeah. I'm not sure I even have a list of 5, so I'd have to be thinking, coming up with it. But technical ability doesn't, like I said earlier, not everyone on the team needs to be technical. Just one person needs to be very strong technically. There are definitely exception cases that even without an incredible technology leader, a company might become successful. It's just I avoid those because it's harder for me to predict that success. But yeah, besides technical ability, I would say, I don't know if this is a trait of the human or just of the idea, but deep conviction about the idea is important to me. So having somebody who has almost a religious level of belief in their idea, and I use the term religion because you need to be able to see a future that evidence doesn't necessarily point to, or you need to have a leap of faith and be able to convince others to follow you in that leap of faith. And when things go poorly, which inevitably they do, you need to have such strong faith that the future is there that you not only keeps yourself going but the rest of your team going. And it's not just your team, it's also convincing investors, it's convincing journalists. There's all sorts of different people you need to convince that what you're doing is important and is going to be successful. It's very hard to do that if your level of conviction to the idea is based on, oh, I did some spreadsheets and it seems like there'll be a lot of money in this, which, or...
Has anyone ever said that to you in a pitch?
No, but yeah, people don't say it in those terms, but sometimes people say, oh, I want to start a company. Let me first spend 3 months brainstorming 30 different ideas and then narrow down, and whichever the best one was, I'll just do that. And they're not starting from a position of saying, oh man, I wish this one thing existed in the world, and I looked everywhere and couldn't find it, so as a last resort, I'm going to start a company to do it, because that's a very different type of thing where it's almost like a disease that someone's obsessed with wishing something was there or wanting to create it and can't cure it, and therefore they start the company to do it. So I'm only a number 2. I don't think I'm going to come up with 5, but conviction, I'd say, is 1. Simply being hard work, perseverance is extremely important. You know, it's, Thomas Edison said once that success is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, and that's my favorite quote about entrepreneurship. Yeah, so entrepreneurs who really are willing to persevere and just work hard. It's funny, I remember when my first company was raising capital, Mike Moritz, who was a legendary VC from Sequoia, visited us, and he basically, what's that?
And the former journalist.
Former journalist, yes.
Important detail.
And we asked him later, when did he know he was going to invest in us? And he said basically from the moment he had walked into our office. And I was really, why? So I remember the day that Mike Moritz visited our office, because I had been sleeping under my desk, and I remember that I remember someone shaking me to be like, Ali, wake up. There's somebody here to meet you. And I was like, who is here? Oh, it's Mike Moritz. And I was like, just a second, I have something to do. So I had to like run to the restroom and brush my teeth and come back. And the other 2 co-founders were also sleeping under their desks. And one of them actually fell asleep in the meeting with Mike Moritz. So we had been, I mean, we were working so hard that we, you know, just, and he decided to invest in us because of this. I don't even know if he spent any time evaluating the idea. He was just cognizant that there was a group of smart kids working themselves to the bone. And anyway, I think I got through 2 or 3. Hope that was a good enough answer.
Yeah, another question here, another one there.
So I think it was Bill Gross from Idea Labs who said that timing for him was the #1 differentiator between a successful company. I think execution and team came 2nd or 3rd. So if you have if you identify a problem, as you said, and you want to develop that's good, but that's almost a kind of microcosm. How do you qualify whether or not the timing is good for everybody else and not just the problem that you feel are paying for?
Yeah, I guess I should say timing is not as big a factor for me. You know, when I think of it, the team is first and market size is second. I suppose market size has a timing element to it, and market size can be measured in dollars or in terms of how much money is spent in that market, but it could also be measured a little bit more intangibly. How many people have this need? How big is this pain that they have? And then how is it changing over time? So I guess the timing element could be that this is a small market today, but there's a trend or some reason to believe that it's growing rapidly. But even if it's a small market, things that have a marketplace dynamic, I'm pretty eager to invest in, because you can have a single company kind of dominate the whole space. Yeah, but I guess generally I would say I would rather focus on the first 2 things than on timing.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
A 30-second pitch, so Kim's happy. I'm Unzube Bodike, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm also an investment manager here at Wayra, UK. A lot of the companies that come through us and we're in touch with have fundraising as a priority, and they have lots of challenges around that. So they get many no's. They're not in a privileged position to have someone who would see them and instantly make a decision. I wondered if you had any tips. Obviously, you're quite successful. You've also invested in several companies. Any tips to share for the companies that they can take away? For example, one thing I do say to many startups is, if you want money, ask for advice, you may get the money. If you ask for money, you generally get advice. So if you have any nuggets, it would be
funny. I recognize the environment is different. The farther you get from Silicon Valley, the rules of Silicon Valley, may not always apply as much. So, but I'll give you some of the points of advice that I give to entrepreneurs, in the Bay Area. One general point of advice is I actually encourage them, don't de-risk. And that everything from don't try to have multiple products or multiple revenue streams or something to fall back on. Have a single product, a single, very focused bet, and go all in on, you know, if you have 3 ideas or variations, don't try to present them all as a way to reduce your risk. Pick whichever you think is best and focus on that entirely. And investors should diversify. If you're investing, you want to have a portfolio where, you know, across 20 things, your risk is diversified. But an individual startup should not be diversifying. It should be a complete, you know, concentrated bet in one thing. And that's relevant to raising money because to successfully convince an investor, you need the investor to fall in love with what you're doing, which is hard enough if you're doing one thing, but if you're doing 3 things, then they need to love all 3 things, and it's less likely to, for them to fall in love. And you're also less likely to do any one of them very well. The other advice I often give is that think of raising money not as a task of convincing people, but rather think of it as a search task, that there might be 1,000 investors out there, and there are 5 or 10 who will fall in love with what you are doing if you only found them. And so rather than trying to convince someone that this is a good idea and they don't like it, then take their advice and change your idea, you know, you'll end up losing your idea and morphing into something based on what other people told you to do, or as I would say, it's, if you have conviction with your idea, just believe that there's somebody out there who also sees the world the way you do, and your task is just to find them. And when you do, there'll be hopefully love at first sight. The last thing I would say is that it's, if possible, it's better to constrain your fundraising into a short period of time. So if you're kind of open for fundraising for months on end, then there's no urgency. Even an investor who likes your idea might be like, oh yeah, it's pretty good. You know, let me know how it goes, keep me updated. There's nothing forcing them to actually, you know, get off the fence and make the investment. Whereas if you're talking to a lot of investors in a short period of time, there's a sense of competition that, you know, if I don't make a decision, someone else might invest in them. And so it's better to, you know, make a list of who all the investors you pitch are, wait, you know, basically let it build up and then go meet them all in a 1 or 2 week period rather than spread out over multiple months.
Do we have any other questions?
Hi, thanks for the talk, that's great. My name's Tim, I'm the founder of an English education company in China and India focusing on improving oral English.
On what English, sorry?
Oral English, yeah,
oral English.
Yeah, and cultural understanding as well.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know, from your experience, is there a decision or an investment you did make that you regretted more than one you didn't make? Because I've always found, like in my time as a sort of founder, that I always regret the things I didn't do rather than the things I did.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's also easier to, because it's awkward to like name something, you know, throw them under the bus. But but I invested in a food tech company called Hampton Creek, which has rebranded itself and changed around since then. But I was in love with this company's mission and potential. It was a company creating alternatives to animal-based foods entirely from plants. So its initial product was mayonnaise made without eggs. It actually now has a product that is like liquid egg substitute that's derived from plants. But the mission was something I was in love with because it had a potential to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture and of, you know, one of the most wasteful you know, industries in the world is animal agriculture. And I overlooked pretty clear warning signs about the founder's integrity, and you know, and ended up, you know, after getting involved, realizing that I had kind of consciously turned a blind eye to things that it was almost embarrassing, kind of obvious things that someone who wasn't in love would have probably been deterred by. So I think as an investor, it's always a risk. I use the word love because just like falling in love with a romantic partner, you can literally choose not to see the bad things about them. And this can sometimes happen when with a company as well. So I don't know if this is a good answer to your question.
Okay, a couple more questions.
Hi, my name is Ansel Adams. I work for co-founder of Wayra. We do next-gen GPS. It's a two-part question. So, what do you think about deep tech technologies, investing in deep tech technologies, number one, number two, B2B versus B2C? And what kind of things are you seeing in Silicon Valley that it's getting you really excited at the
So I do enjoy investing in deep tech, although I would say it depends on whether the founder has a sense of there being a market for what they're creating. So I don't like investing in technology just for the sake of technology. There's very often situations where there's some really cool technology but doesn't serve a particular need, and you end up with a company that is a solution in search of a problem. But having said that, companies that really create a paradigm shift in tech are companies that it's rare to have a huge paradigm shift, but those can sometimes be the best investments. Dropbox, arguably, you might consider a deep tech company. There's a company called Nirvana I invested in 4 or 5 years ago, creating specialized chips for deep learning for AI, and it was acquired by Intel. Now it's basically the AI division of Intel. And the second part of your question about what's in Silicon Valley today, there's a whole new group of new hardware companies, new chips, because the Moore's law has kind of plateaued. I guess this is pretty well known, I suppose, but the speed at which computers keep getting faster and cheaper had been crazy for the past few decades, whereas now it's kind of reached a saturation point. And there's roughly two different schools of efforts for how to get past this. One is to make specialized chips for specific tasks, such as AI in the case of Nirvana, or specialized crypto chips, or so on. And then the other is completely new physical materials, something other than silicon. And that's kind of a exciting but scary realm. And there are a few companies doing that. And I've invested in both of those paths because if one is successful, it could potentially be a really big breakthrough in computation.
Scary because of the amount of money that it requires to get a chip company off the ground. I mean, there was a long time when startup chip companies just were uninvestable because of the capital requirements.
Yeah, so hardware is exactly what you said, because it's so capital intensive, is more scary. I guess also because, scary may not be the right word, but when something is, unproven, new, it's essentially within the laws of physics, but it's a completely new physical material, it's just harder to predict how it might go wrong. What if it melts, or what if unexpected things happen just because it hasn't been in use for the way silicon has been the bedrock of computation for 30, 40, 50 years, and the whole Silicon Valley is named after it. So to go beyond that is it's a pretty big leap to see as to whether something will hold up.
How long do you think it'll take before we find out whether those things are working?
Well, I have a few investments that I'm eager to see.
But not decades in the case.
Hopefully not decades, no.
Right.
Yeah, we'll see. 2 or 3 years, hopefully.
Okay. Do we have another question at the front and at the back? If we've got a mic. Sorry. And then there's another one right in front as well.
Hi, great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up what you were saying about 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. And particularly with the startups, it kind of, at the entrepreneurial stage and the magic of the idea and the verve of the founder, it almost thrives because there's not necessarily a huge amount of structure and process in place. Fast forward to when they've sold it for millions of dollars, and it can only function because it's got all these different structures in place for where Dropbox or these huge companies are now. So I'm just really interested in your perspective. It's obviously not a linear change from it was chaos and it's now hugely disciplined. But I'm really interested in what you've seen worked really well, making that transition, both in terms of people not killing themselves in the process, but actually needing to bring that kind of graft and drive, and I suppose ultimately not losing the magic, such that even though it then becomes a huge company like Dropbox, Pinterest, or whichever else, you've still got that sense of magic, but the reach is so much more scalable. So it's really a question about what are the principles that you see about as organizations develop, them being really effective in the structures that they have.
Yeah, I think I can do a better job articulating the challenge than the solution. You know, basically, as you pointed out very well, there is a metamorphosis that happens when a company is 5 or 6 people. There's almost not an org chart sometimes, or they might have a CEO and everybody else is not CEO, and they kind of work like a more like a school project, and somehow they have to end up 5 years later being a large organization with with an org chart and divisions and VPs and so on, and that's not a straight line. There's companies often go through what I might call the teenage years, or very, very challenging transitions, and I'm not sure I've seen a list of rules that make that easy. Type of things that can be challenging are that the founders might have started out as buddies and they all think of each other as as friends, maybe not as complete equals, but at least close to each other, and then the one who's the CEO stays at the top, and the other one, no longer reports to the CEO because they hired someone in between, and that might cause enormous tension between 2 people who started out as close friends, and now they have 2 levels of reporting hierarchy between them. You end up with situations where sometimes somebody gets bitter and leaves, or it needs to be let go, and these are very difficult, human challenges. There's no way to kind of ignore that or to smooth it over. You also have, the case of Uber, the culture there, I don't think they set out to have a toxic culture. In fact, I'd say the culture was so hardworking, it was basically success at all costs, and they were incredibly determined and fast-moving, which, to their credit, they built an amazing business. To their discredits, they kind of had cut a lot of corners and kind of ignored a lot of issues and basically kicked the can down the road on a number of warning signs. And now they have a large cleanup task. It's a little hard to say. If they had not cut those corners, if they'd done it the right way earlier, maybe they wouldn't have moved as fast, and maybe they wouldn't be as successful as they are today. So it's kind of easy to criticize, but I'm not sure if there's a single proper way to do it. I guess the one thing I'd say on a positive note is that it helps if you at least have a vision of what will our org chart look like, what is it we want to be, and and so at least if you're on the same page as where we are heading, then it makes it a bit easier to go through that, through those challenges. I remember actually Brian Chesky of Airbnb said this, that for him, as he was thinking about Airbnb's culture, he was always thinking about it not in terms of where we are today, but where do we aim to be 10 years from now. And the analogy he made is, if you're raising a child who's 5 years old, you're not thinking about what to do to make them grow up into a good 6-year-old. You're thinking about what will this child be as an adult, and every decision you make, you're thinking about the very long-term consequences of how it shapes your child. And you should think of a company the same way as decisions you make now might have. Think about where you want it to be 10, 20 years from now.
I think we had one more at the front, and then I'm going to lob in a final question as well.
Hey. I'm fine.
I think it's on camera, so we can perhaps do it.
Thanks again. I'm Jacob. I'm the founder of Stasho. It's a storage marketplace. My question is a little bit controversial maybe, but with Neo and the process that you're going through there, is there a risk that you can make it like too comfortable for the guys that you're sort of talent scouting and saying, these guys are great, there's a guarantee I'll invest in them? If they sort of bypass that process where it's like, you know, like what you went through as an entrepreneur, where you kind of have to earn the sort of right to fundraise, or not the right to fundraise, but you know what I mean, you have to kind of go through that. Is there a risk that making that too comfortable is maybe stifles innovation, or by contrast, do you think by kind of cutting that part out and kind of meaning they don't have to worry, it's actually better for business development?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know. Time will tell. But what I'm betting on is the caliber of young people that I've brought together are cognizant of how valuable their own time is. So they're not going to just start some frivolous company simply because they can raise the money. If anything, it actually puts the onus on them to, hey, if I know that I can raise money, better make it something that's really worth it, type of thing, and to think bigger. So yeah, I mean, the students in NEO generally have multiple job offers, very high compensation offers from, you know, they can have their choice of company, but most of these students, by the time they're graduating from college, literally they have, you know, every tech company trying to hire them. So it's still kind of hard to convince them that you should start a startup because they might be seduced by a huge salary at Stripe or, you know, Facebook or so on. And I guess I generally believe that for someone to start a startup, it's so risky, it's so terrifying. Funding is one of the things that makes it scary, but it's still also the fear of failure and of, you know, being ashamed of yourself. Hopefully, I think that's enough to make them still be discriminating about what idea they do and to do something that's really worth it.
And yeah, just the final one from me, if this mic ever works.
Yeah, final one from me is just, I mean, there's a few companies in your portfolio that are likely to be going public in the next sort of little while. We're not sort of asking for share tips, but do you feel like, I mean, there's a lot of companies with very big sort of valuations being attached to them, you know, as they go public. Do you think that people that are there are companies that people are underestimating in this kind of next cycle, and how do you think all these big IPOs, Uber, Airbnb, et al, will kind of change the valley in the coming years afterwards?
I can answer this, but I'm definitely not an expert or particularly qualified to predict much of this. How it changes the valley, I hope the pendulum swings back a little bit in terms of more companies going public a little sooner. I think we've seen a 10-year period where companies postpone going public as long as they can, and there are rational reasons to delay it. It's a pain in the neck to go public and super expensive, and you can now get most of the benefits without going public. You can get liquidity other ways, you can raise money other ways, but being a public company has some intangible benefits. The forced transparency also brings with it legitimacy. It brings a sort of comfort to your employees that we're now finally legit. Employees at private companies often kind of secretly harbor some insecurity that until we're public, we haven't really arrived yet. And it also brings a sanitizing influence that transparency forces you to do the right thing and not think you can get away with cutting corners. And so I'm hoping that change will happen, but we don't know. And as far as share prices, I'm a huge believer in both Uber and Airbnb, and I'd like to think there's a lot of growth left ahead of them. I was reminded of Amazon for its first 10, or I forget how many years, at least for the entire first decade, people would make fun of Amazon for losing money. there were always people saying, this is the dumbest business ever, it loses money on every book it sells. And I always felt like they know where they're heading, you know, this is an investment period. And it's funny because I think some of those same people are now critiquing Amazon for its tax, you know, not owing as much taxes or something. There's been a meme about that in the US at least. And probably those same people are the ones now making fun of Lyft or Uber for losing money. But you know, Lyft and Uber are in an enormous, extraordinary market, and they're still in a market share gaining phase. So actually making profit is, I think whenever they're ready to make profits, they would, you know, be able to be very profitable. So likewise, Airbnb is, I'd say, still has enormous growth ahead of it as well.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for your questions, and thanks for coming. Yeah.